I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the UN report on last summer's war in Gaza, issued by a commission of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and no surprises to anyone. The report slams the state of Israel and accuses the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, of human rights violations and of war crimes. And by now, Israel is used to it. American Jews are used to it. There's simply a stunning anti-Israel bias in today's United Nations. As Israeli UN Ambassador Ron Prosor now says repeatedly, the UN is like living in a, believe it or not, museum. Of course, Jews everywhere, in America, in Israel, everywhere, are sensitive to the suffering of Palestinian families, caught in the crossfire between Hamas and the state of Israel. And this time, the Commission report does criticize the Palestinians as well. But there's a profoundly disturbing lopsidedness to the UN report, which states Israel's blockade and the military operation in Gaza have led to chronic, widespread, and systematic violations of human rights. The report also suggests that Israel does not hold to account those in the IDF who are guilty of human rights violations. And the UN Commission asks Israel to, quote, break with its recent lamentable track record in holding wrongdoers accountable. Well, for reaction to the publication of this report on the war in Gaza by the Commission of the UN Human Rights Council, I'm so pleased to have on our JBS phones an individual who's had a good deal of experience with this very kind of report, Alan Dershowitz, who, of course, for many years, virtually a lifetime, taught at Harvard Law School and has been in the forefront of virtually every human rights issue of the past 40-plus years. And Alan's most recent book is entitled Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. Alan, thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you, but you're focusing, I think, on the wrong institution. Everybody understands the Human Rights Council is a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran, Syria, and other massive violators of human rights. The focus should be on the New York Times, which has an editorial essentially agreeing with the Human Rights Council's assessment, saying, well, we can't expect much from Hamas, but we should really hold Israel accountable. This kind of moral equivalence between a democratic country that's trying to protect its civilians from attacks and a terrorist group that commits double war crimes every time it fires from behind human shields is an abomination. And the New York Times is far more culpable even than the United Nations because it has the credibility and the kind of deep commitment by many readers and responsibility to tell the truth. And its editorial is just a misapplication of human rights law. Now, the Commission report itself is, of course, obviously biased. For example, it doesn't conclude that Hamas uses human shields.
Yes.
It basically says if it does use human shields, that's a violation of international law. But it does conclude that Israel uses human shields, which is just absurd. Israel does everything to prevent civilian casualties. It actually turns Israel's unique use of warnings against it, saying by warning civilians, it actually increases the problem because it then attacks the buildings after the civilians have been given an opportunity to leave. It's such an abomination to anybody who cares deeply about human rights. But as I said, the New York Times is far more culpable because we expect more of it, applying the very standard that the Times applied to itself. The Times said we expect more of Israel than we do of Hamas. Well, we expect more of the New York Times than we do of the Human Rights Council, and the New York Times failed miserably in its assessment of this horrible and biased report.
Yes. Alan, do you want to hazard a guess why that would be true? Why would the Times slant it this way?
Israel's major enemy today are other Jews. If you look at who is attacking Israel most credibly, it is organizations like Breaking the Silence, which was quoted by the New York Times, and by the Human Rights Council. Breaking the Silence is a group of radical left-wing people who were drafted into the Israeli army, most of them reluctantly. Most of them hate Israel. And then they just repeat lies about Israel without any documentation, without any names, without any specifics. But because they're a Jewish organization consisting of former Israeli soldiers, they have undeserved credibility. And there's the New York Times, owned by a Jewish family, which has been trying desperately since its founding to shed itself of any Jewishness during the Holocaust. They failed to report on the Holocaust and failed to, they didn't want to be identified with Jewish suffering. And now they lean over backwards to condemn Israel at every turn. It was amazing that today or yesterday they actually had an op-ed piece critical of the Iranian deal, but that was unique in among the last 50 or 60 op-eds. And then, of course, you get J Street. J Street, which claims to be pro-Israel, but gives cover to all the massive anti-Israel groups. We haven't heard from them yet, at least I haven't heard from them yet on this UN report, but they probably won't criticize it. When the Goldstone report came out, they brought Goldstone to Washington.
Yes.
And even though the Obama administration condemned the Goldstone report, J Street essentially supported it. I suspect they'll do the same here. J Street supports and really goes beyond the Obama administration's policy in relation to Iran, even though that's not an issue on which Israelis are divided. Herzog, the opposition leader, has criticized the Iran report, but J Street supports it. The Iran deal, but J Street supports it. So the major enemies of Israel today, the most credible enemies, are Jews and people who use their Jewishness to increase their credibility. It's called the argument by ethnic identification. It's much like the fallacy of the ad hominem argument, but this argument goes this way. We're Jews, we're Israelis, so if we're critical of Israel, we must be telling them the truth.
Incidentally, you've taken me a hair off the questions I had in mind, but I find what you're saying so fascinating. How do you see the BDS movement in this entire picture, which has received so much attention of late, Alan?
Well, first of all, I think Jewish leadership has come late to the BDS movement.
Yes.
When I first started calling attention to the BDS movement, I was told by several Jewish leaders, ignore it, it's going nowhere, because they misunderstood it. Its goal is not to get BDS in the United States. That won't succeed. Nobody is going to boycott Israeli scholars. No university is going to divest. Co-ops that are trying to divest from Israel will be put out of business. Universities that seek to divest from Israel will lose contributions. So it will fail. But what it's doing is it's creating a groundswell of hatred against Israel among college students who believe these lies if they're told often enough. So it's very important to fight it. It will succeed in Europe. In parts of Europe, there will be divestment, there will be boycotts, there will be sanctions. But it will not succeed in the United States in the immediate future, but it will create a foundation by which future leaders, people who are now in college and in graduate school, and who will be presidents of the United States in 20 years, editors of major newspapers, hedge fund operators, and others, will have such a knee-jerk opposition to Israel. They'll believe what they read from J Street and from other organizations like that specialize in bashing Israel.
Do you worry that the BDS movement will affect the way in which college students do or do not experience college if they come with a pro-Israel perspective?
No. The students who come with a pro-Israel perspective are fine. They fight back. They're doing a great job. They organize. There are many organizations on campus, such as Stand With Us and Camera on Campus. Less and less Hillel. Hillel is now becoming part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Hillel is becoming a platform through which J Street and other anti-Israel organizations are given credibility. The pro-Israel students have no problem. They're strong. They'll stand up. They're much stronger than the pro-Israel professors, who, for the most part, lack courage and will not express views publicly that they express privately. The real problem is the students who come in without very much knowledge of Israel. And they will be influenced by the BDS movement. And that's the vast majority of students.
Yes.
Maybe 10 or 15% of students come to colleges and universities with strong pro-Israel feelings, and maybe 10 or 15% come to colleges with strong anti-Israel feelings. But it's the 70 or 80% that come in with little information, knowledge, and few opinions that can be influenced by the BDS lies.
There was once a time when you did a great deal of speaking on college campuses. I just don't know, Alan, if that's what you're still doing and what your experience is if you do go to campus. What is your experience?
I speak all over the world on college campuses, and what I find is what I've just said, namely 10 or 15% strongly pro-Israel, 10 or 15%, most more vocal, strongly anti-Israel, and the largest percentage not really interested or knowing much, but influenced by their professors. And remember, there are an equal number of pro-Israel and anti-Israel professors on campus. The problem is the anti-Israel professors speak loudly, speak often, and the the pro-Israel professors, for the most part, have no courage. I blame the pro-Israel professors more than the anti-Israel professors for the current problems on university campuses. I have to tell you, 50 years of teaching at Harvard and many other universities around the world, I have never met a group of less courageous people than tenured full professors, and particularly tenured full professors who support Israel privately, but who don't have the guts to speak out because they think they'll be hurt, they'll have their credibility influenced, they'll have their ratings, and all that's true. But tenure means you have to have the courage of your convictions, and too many pro-Israel professors don't have the courage of their convictions.
I appreciate that very, very much, Alan. Okay, so you were intimately involved when the Goldstone report came out. And one of the things I was very anxious to hear you talk about is how you compare the vitriol in each of the two documents, the Goldstone report and now this one. Do you see similarities? Do you see differences?
I think there are some differences, and the differences is this one has a greater pretense at credibility and fairness. But when you look at it closely, there's no fairness at all. It's a completely biased, one-sided report, which uses different evidentiary criteria when dealing with Israel and when dealing with Hamas. One point I made before is they don't find sufficient evidence to conclude that Hamas uses human shields. And everybody knows that Hamas uses human shields. It fires deliberately from crowded areas. There's photographs that prove it. But no, not to the satisfaction of this bias group. But it does find that Israel uses human shields because they claim occasionally the Israelis will bring prisoners to areas where their soldiers are, which are combatant areas, before transferring them to civilian areas where they're being held as prisoners of war. So as the result of that, they conclude that Israel uses human shields as a matter of evidence, but that it's undetermined whether or not Hamas uses human shields. It's a complete reversal of any logic, common sense, and evidence.
Mm-hmm. But still, I want to hear you tell me how you compare it to Goldstone. Was Goldstone more vicious than this, or is this more vicious?
Goldstone report said that Israel has a policy at the highest level of deliberately killing Palestinian civilians.
Yes, an Israeli policy, right.
Yeah, from the top level.
Right.
This report says that the top levels have policies which have the effect of killing civilians, but they don't point with the same viciousness to intentionality on the part of Israeli leaders.
Okay, and we saw that the Obama administration criticized the Goldstone report. What do you expect to come out of the American administration now?
Well, I would hope it would criticize this report as well. It should. The report is so self-evidently and obviously biased. The Human Rights Council is obviously biased. It has condemned Israel more than all the other countries of the world combined at a time when ISIS is killing children for eating during Ramadan. You don't see reports about that. But, if this same commission had looked at American actions in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in other parts of the world where we are fighting ISIS, they would find exactly the same things that Israel's doing, except the United States doesn't have this warning system, and the United States has a far worse ratio of killing civilians to combatants than Israel does. But if it applied the same criteria it applies to Israel, to every Western democracy, it would find the same conclusions, that according to their lights, they're guilty of war crimes. Now, what they're going to say is, you're changing the subject. We're talking about Israel now. It reminds me of President Lowell when he was presiding over an anti-Semitic administration at Harvard University. He said, we have to keep down the number of Jews because Jews cheat. And Judge Lerner Hand wrote back and said, but President Lowell, Christians cheat too. And Lowell wrote back, you're changing the subject. We're talking only about Jews now. And that's what the Human Rights Council and Commission does. It talks only about the nation state of the Jewish people. It doesn't evaluate them by a comparative standard that all other countries should be evaluated by. And then it applies an even looser standard to Hamas. So, any serious scholar looking at this report would find it laughable or cryable, but it's not at all serious.
Okay. Before I let you go, two very quick questions. Where do you stand today on the U.S. administration's view of the Iranian deal?
I think the U.S. administration has made it easy for Iran to get whatever it wants. The U.S. has backed away from many of the provisions it insisted on earlier. I wouldn't hire these guys to negotiate a one-month lease for me. They are the worst negotiators I've ever seen. They let the Iranians know in advance that they need a deal more than the Iranians do, which is exactly the opposite of true. And they've let the Iranians dictate the deal. There's an excellent op-ed in today's New York Times from an expert who is an expert on atomic proliferation, who concludes that the evidence shows that under the deal, Iran's breakout time would be 3 months, not a year, and that they can easily develop a weapon during the course of the deal.
Yes.
But by the time the deal's over, they would have a breakout time of days. And so this buys Israel, the United States, and the world virtually nothing, and it gives the Iranians everything they wanted in terms of eliminating sanctions and giving them a green light to develop nuclear weapons, if not sooner, certainly in 10 years.
Okay, and
so it's a terrible, terrible deal.
Yeah,
and Congress has an obligation to scrutinize it carefully, and I hope Congress will reject the deal.
Okay. You and I were together, I believe it now is 2 years ago, maybe 1 year ago. Time conflates in my mind here. When you spoke at the Jerusalem Post conference and you were booed. This past year, Jacob Lew, the Secretary of the Treasury, spoke in front of the Jerusalem Post conference, and he was booed, and it made a lot of headlines. When you read the headlines, you weren't at the conference this year, but when you heard about it, did you have any thoughts of your own, Alan?
Of course. Well, first of all, I refuse to come to the conference this year because I will not serve as fodder to a bunch of extremist right-wing ideologues and fanatics who boo every time they hear two-state solution, occupation, or anything critical of Israel, or every time they hear the word Obama. I wish Lou had asked me. I would have told him not to show up at the Jerusalem Post Conference. I will never, ever again speak at the Jerusalem Post Conference until and unless they insist on orderliness and a seriousness by the audience. The audience has a right of free speech. They have a right to boo if they want to, and I have a right not to go. And I'm exercising that right, and I wish Jack Lew, who's a very strong supporter of Israel, had not gone to the Jerusalem Post Conference. I wish others would boycott the conference as well until and unless they can have their audiences show any kind of a semblance of decency and respect for serious argument, nuance, and intellectual discussion. The audience is the problem, but the Jerusalem Post has to figure out a way of controlling that audience. Next year, they're not going to get any speakers. Everybody now knows about the Lou thing. When I refused to speak, it was because they booed Ehud Olmert, not so much because they booed me.
That's right.
And Ehud Olmert, was a great, great prime minister. He came very close to bringing about peace in Israel. And to boo the prime minister of Israel and to boo the president of the United States shows such a lack of just basic derech eretz, just basic, politeness. And I just don't want to be part of that program anymore. I will continue to write for the Jerusalem Post, but I will not go to their conference.
Alan, you know, I love talking to you all the time. You continue the great work you're doing, and I'll chase you, and sometimes we'll sit together in person.
I'll always be easy to catch.
Thank you, my friend. You be well. Thank you.
Sure, you too. Bye.
The thoughts of Alan Dershowitz. And again, you know, you can love him, you can hate him, but one thing you'll always hear from his perspective, an honest, straightforward, and from his perspective, truthful analysis. And it's just refreshing to have somebody speak as openly and candidly and very often brilliantly in a Jewish context. I'm always thrilled to have Alan Dershowitz on. I also wanted you to hear some Israeli reaction to the publication of this report on the war in Gaza by the Commission of the UN Human Rights Commission. And so I'm very pleased to have on our phones now Benny Avni, the diplomatic correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Benny, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Benny, what was your reaction when you read and had time to digest this commission report on the war in Gaza?
You know what? There's a major difference. This is in regard to previous questions that you asked, Dershowitz. There's a major difference between the Goldstone report and the current report,
Please.
And that is the context in which it was published, and that goes to the heart of what this report is all about. The Goldstone report was just throwing mud at Israel for the sake of throwing mud.
Mm-hmm.
This report is in the context of a major shift in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is the joining of the PLO, of the Palestinian Authority, to the International Criminal Court. The way to read this report, this Human Rights Council report, is as a roadmap for the prosecutor for the ICC, for the International Criminal Court, to launch a case against Israel. If you read it that way, first of all, that's what they recommend. Obviously, at the end of the report, one of the major recommendations is, A, for Israel to join the Rome Statute, which is the way to join the court. Israel is not a member of the court. Neither, by the way, is the U.S. or Russia or China. But it recommends that Israel will join the court, and it recommends for the international community to support the ICC investigations and prosecution, basically, on cases regarding that happened in Gaza. It also, as part of its analysis, as part of its recommendation, it says that Israel does not adequately investigate its own soldiers when it comes to war crimes.
Yes.
So basically, it paints a generalized picture of how to get to the Supreme Court, to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court, but it also gives a list of Israelis who should be on the dock. You know, the ICC does not try states; it tries individuals. So it says that the highest level of leadership, namely Netanyahu, has realized that the knock on roof system does not work, and therefore it must have changed its tactic. By not changing it, it may have committed war crimes. So try Netanyahu. But it doesn't stop there. It actually goes to, I don't want to mention the name, because unlike the standards that this ICC reports, I do have some standards. It says that an Israeli major in the IDF reportedly said, and then it gives a long quote of what he said, and it gives his name. They don't mention who the source for that report is, and they're just saying that he said that basically at the time of war there should be no difference between civilians and combatants. And that by itself could constitute a war crime. So you have a name of a major. Mm-hmm. We're not talking now about the chief of staff or the prime minister. We're talking about the major, like a mid-level officer with his name that should be on the dock of the ICC if you apply that.
Yes.
And so we have a situation here in which this report, written by a U.S. judge, in a very lawyerly fashion, basically paints a roadmap for the ICC on how to launch a case against Israel.
Yes. Benny, as an Israeli, how does this make you feel?
Well, look, it's not only as an Israeli. I'm also an American citizen. And I think that, as Alan Dershowitz said, never mind Alan Dershowitz, also Martin Dempsey, the former chief of staff, said that Israel has used very high standards in military terms of trying to avoid hitting civilians. And so, there's no question that if you apply this standard to any Western army that is fighting terrorism, they would be on the dock of the ICC, and they would have been suspected, as this report says time and time again about Israeli leadership and its commanders, they will be suspected of war crimes. Mm-hmm. And to apply that word war crimes to people whose sole job is to assure that that people don't suffer from terror is a ridiculous way to fight a war. And P.S. It's not only that it will make Israel's attempts to fight terrorism that much harder, but if you fight the war with a lawyer that has already, by the way, the IDF has to almost every unit, it has one expert in international law, lawyer, that basically oversees most of its operation. But, I mean, if you have to fight a war as if it's just a prelude to a trial against you, then you can never win a war.
Yes.
And if you can't win the war, you will have the next war. The
yes.
more that the war against Hamas in Gaza is unresolved, the more often you will have events like this. So as an Israeli, as an American, as someone who cares a lot about human rights, including those of Palestinians, I think this is a bad report for you.
Benny, it's always good to talk to you, even if it's just for a moment. We have to one day sit face to face and continue the discussion, but I thank you for always being available to me. I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Benny Avni, the diplomatic correspondent for Newsweek magazine. In general, what you're hearing from both Alan Dershowitz and Benny Avni is the notion that the UN has come out with a very biased report. As I said at the outset, no one's surprised. It still hurts. And my imagination is that virtually all of Israel is sort of disgusted. Most of American Jewry is disgusted, and we will continue to persevere. My thanks to Sloan Copeland and Serge Goldberg for putting together this edition of In the News, as well as our producer, Ron Jacobsohn. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.